This is the Republic of Ireland, a country home to 5.1 million people that are all becoming the wealthiest citizens in the world. As proof, Ireland's GDP per capita is larger than traditionally rich nations like Switzerland and Norway, and this publication from the Central Bank of Ireland pointed out that 1 in 8 households in Ireland are millionaires, at least on paper. But ask any Irish people you knew, and they will tell you that Ireland is not a good place to live in, to the point that 7 out of 10 young people in Ireland want to emigrate somewhere else. The cost of living is through the roof, housing is unaffordable that many people live with their parents, and it is hard to find a job. It's as if they are the victim of their own success. So, what happened? How is it that a country so rich and advanced is at the same time deemed almost unlivable by its own people? Well, today, we're going to explore this paradox. But before we do that, I want to explore a more fundamental question. How does Ireland become so rich in the first place? Because you see, the economic history of Ireland is mired with centuries of poverty, hunger, and social unrest. In the 1850s, the Great Famine of Ireland claimed the lives of 1 million people, with another 2 million fleeing the country to survive, causing the country's population to fall by 20 to 25%. This permanently changed Ireland's demographic landscape and triggered a century-long population decline. It took the island exactly 165 years, from 1851 to 2016, to be able to restore its population back to its original numbers. That's just how severe the famine is. In 1922, 70 years after the famine, Ireland, except for Northern Ireland, managed to gain its independence after a bloody war with the British. Being a country that was caught up in a civil war, the economic conditions were not the best. This building, for example, Ireland's most prominent courts building, was destroyed in a fire after it got seized by the anti-treaty forces and then bombarded by the National Army. The same can be said about factories and public infrastructures like roads and railways that were destroyed during the war. Even after its independence, it had to rely on short-term borrowing from Irish banks for the few years of its existence, because apparently, people don't want to pay taxes for an unstable state when they're struggling to even survive. In 1930, when the Great Depression took the world by surprise, Ireland was caught completely unprepared and suffered greatly because of it. Worse, the country also entered an economic war with the British Empire, its largest trading partner. You see, at the time, Ireland was a predominantly agrarian country that depended heavily on exporting beef and dairy products like cheese and milk to the UK. During the 1930s, they entered a dispute over land annuities, and Britain put tariffs on Irish beef, and Ireland retaliated by imposing tariffs on British consumer goods. This economic war, coupled with the Great Depression, makes life truly miserable for the Irish people, and they wanted to change that. It's time to put an end to the Irish dependence on its former ruler and to be able to stand up for themselves. So, Ireland looked to a country for inspiration. A country that was strong, independent, and thriving during a period of economic suffering for the rest of the world. That country was the Soviet Union. Now, I know that may sound like a joke, but the 1930 Soviet were a strong economy that had lots of factories and lots of people to work in those factories. So, even when they pursued protectionist policies and closed off their economy to the rest of the world, the Soviets rapidly industrialized, and later in the 1950s, they eventually became the second largest economy in the world. You can watch my video on the rise and fall of the Soviet economy to learn more about this. And yes, there was a massive famine from 1930 to 1933 that claimed the lives of 6 to 8 million Soviets. But back then, the world doesn't know that the Soviets had a massive famine, as the state actively denies its existence. Even the New York Times, arguably the most credible source of news at the time, downplayed the situation and claimed that Russians were hungry but not starving, and that there was no such thing as a famine. So from the perspective of 1930s Ireland, the Soviet Union was a good example to imitate, and Ireland started implementing protectionist policies. But things don't go according to plan. You see, The reason why the Soviets were sort of successful in pursuing protectionist policies is that they were industrialized, blessed with lots of natural resources, and have a massive labor pool to tap into. So they could produce every food, tool, and equipment they needed at home without any sort of trade with the outside world. They did produce these products inefficiently, but in the end, they got the job done. Ireland, meanwhile, was hardly industrialized to begin with, and they don't have a large population nor any natural resources to be able to produce the goods that they need at scale. So when the state of Ireland closed off its economy and forcefully nationalized private companies, they were left with few factories, few workers, and no natural resources whatsoever to be able to make stuff that people need in order to live. So again, Ireland's economy tanks even more and another 500,000 people fled the country. But more importantly, Ireland also missed out on the post-World War II economic boom that occurred in the rest of Europe due to its protectionist policies. In the 1950s, while the rest of Europe were recovering, Ireland was again still a poor country to the point that it was called the sick man of Europe. So something had to change. And a change did happen in 1958 when they realized that protectionism doesn't work at all and started opening up again to the world. Many economists and historians think that the decision to abandon protectionism and move to a more open economy is one of the most important decisions in the history of Ireland. And exactly 1 year later, in 1959, they established something. This is Shannon's International Airport. At the first glance, it's just a normal airport, quite small and unremarkable even. But what lies outside this airport is one of the key factors of why Ireland became so rich today. You see, right outside Shannon's airport is an international business park and also the world's first modern free trade zone. This free trade zone was established because prior to 1959, international companies weren't exactly fond of investing their money in a country as poor and unstable as Ireland. But this free trade zone changes everything. What it did was to allow businesses to not pay any value-added tax for imports of items, not pay any tax on imported goods from non-EU countries used for processing, aka raw materials, exemption of customs duties for export countries outside of the EU, and a corporate tax rate as low as 12.5%. All of these might seem quite common today, but remember this was back in 1959, when high tariffs on imported goods were the norm. So at the time, this was quite revolutionary. And many current free trade zones like the one in Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Panama, and Copenhagen are all directly inspired from Shannon. Now, the Shannon Free Trade Zone was able to attract companies like Intel, Sony, and 100 other companies. It generates 3.3 billion euros every year for Ireland, and it has become the main source of foreign direct investment for Ireland, while also creating high-quality, high-paying jobs for the local economy. And also, it is worth mentioning that the reason why Shannon's Free Trade Zone was able to attract so many international companies wasn't just low taxes. After all, other countries could easily copy Ireland and open up their own free trade zones, and many actually did. The other reason why is that Ireland is located between the USA and Europe, two of the biggest industrial centers at the time. Especially from the perspective of the USA, Ireland is like the gateway to Europe that it had to pass through in order to get to the UK, France, or Germany. In fact, the reason why Shannon International Airport was chosen to become a free trade zone in the first place was that it was the busiest refueling stop for US airlines headed into Europe. A usual flight route starts from New York, Boston, or Chicago, then to a small Canadian town called Gander for a brief stop, then across the Atlantic Ocean heading to Shannon's International Airport for a refuel, and then headed to its original destinations like London, Paris, or Berlin. This geographical advantage, along with other factors like a high standard of education and an English-speaking population, has made Ireland the preferred state for international companies to set up its operations there. Starting in 1990, Ireland experienced an economic miracle that makes it from one of the poorest countries to one of the richest. The government started liberalizing labor laws that make it easier for businesses to hire and fire employees. So more and more foreign businesses started to come to Ireland and hire more Irish people, creating employment for Ireland, plus enjoying its 12.5% tax rate, one of the lowest in the world. Ireland's economic miracle created a new nickname for them, the Celtic Tiger, because of its miraculous growth that massively improved the standards of living for the Irish people. From 1995 to 2000, Ireland's economy grew consistently at a rate of 9 to 10% each year. Foreign investment as a component of GDP rose from a mere 2.2% to 49.2%. Unemployment was gone since foreign businesses were coming and constantly looking for workers, creating many high-quality, well-paying jobs. So the average wage for Irish workers became 20% higher compared to workers in the UK. Quite a remarkable achievement. And the timing was perfect as well. The 1990s was characterized by technological innovations like the rise of Microsoft, the tech boom that saw growth in internet usage and the proliferation of venture capital, eventually leading to the dot-com bubble, low commodity prices, especially oil, and extremely low interest rates that flooded the world with cheap capital. The timing couldn't be better for Ireland to be able to accommodate foreign companies that were constantly looking for places to invest in. So external factors such as these do play a huge part in Ireland's economic miracle. But Ireland's success is a double-edged sword, and it brings some unintended consequences. First of all, Ireland's growth method of relying heavily on foreign investment is risky, because if the global economy tanks or if the Fed raises US interest rates, then Ireland will be hyper-exposed to a risk that it can't control. In this case, the level of US investments into Ireland. Of course, every country in the world are exposed to the swings of the global economy to some extent, but having 49.2% of GDP to foreign investment is simply too dangerous. Furthermore, the combination of extremely low interest rates, high level of investment, poor banking regulations, and irrational exuberance in the 1990s also resulted in a real estate bubble, when anyone that has low income could easily buy luxury properties because banks were willing to lend. Banks thought that property prices will never go down, and it was safe to hold property as their collateral for the loan. But the unexpected happened and property prices eventually fell, with prices in big cities like Dublin falling more than 50% during the 2008 global financial crisis, eventually resulting in a $62.5 billion bailout for Irish banks, $22.5 billion from the IMF, $22.5 billion from the EU, and $17.5 billion from the Irish government. That figure was about 40% of Ireland's entire GDP. Now, I told you in the beginning that Ireland's GDP is larger than traditionally rich nations like Switzerland and Norway, but that turned out to be a fluke. You see, in 2015, Ireland recorded a GDP growth rate of 25%. That's an insane number that not even China could achieve in 3 years, but Ireland did it in a single year. So, how did this happen then? Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman described this phenomenon as leprechaun economics. The real reason for this growth rate was that companies like Apple and Microsoft were moving their profit to Ireland to enjoy Ireland's low tax rate. And yeah, Apple and Microsoft do have the money to inflate a country's GDP growth numbers. After all, Ireland has a smaller population than New York. This incident shows that statistics don't always reflect reality. Because 60% of the money invested into Ireland was just sitting in the bank accounts. It was not being used for R&D, or hiring more people, or for opening up factories that will benefit the local economy. So in this case, GDP growth numbers cannot be trusted to measure economic prosperity, despite that's what it is exactly supposed to do. And this also ties into another problem. The cost of living in Ireland is just too expensive. Although in Ireland, what's expensive is not goods like a car, home furnishing, or daily necessities. What's expensive in Ireland are services and housing, especially renting a home. Renting a home in Dublin is more expensive than renting a home in Paris, Rome, and Berlin. And it is rising at 10% per year, reaching €2,000 per month. Medical costs are also very high, 92% more than the EU average, which is alarming. For example, the fee to visit a GP in Ireland is about €50, compared to €25 in France. And the fee to visit a specialist medical consultant is around €60 in France, but it's around €200 for a first-time visit in Ireland. And Ireland's growth model of relying on foreign investment also creates massive inequality in the country. Around 40% of income is held by the richest 10%, and social benefits like subsidies make up 70% of the income for the 20% poorest in Ireland. Part of this is geography. 40% of Irish people live in Dublin, which has more employment opportunities and higher income than other regions that were left behind. Labor participation is also worrying, especially women and young people facing more uncertain job opportunities after the COVID pandemic. And also, Ireland is not a tax haven anymore, so it lost its biggest advantage and will no longer attract foreign companies, right? Wrong. Actually, despite rising taxes and Shannon's free trade zone losing nearly all of its special privileges, Ireland is still the home of hundreds of international companies that employ thousands of high-skilled workers. Today, it seems that there is no reason for international companies to set up their business in Ireland. There are no more tax loopholes to use, there's no free trade zone anymore, and taxes are still low, but there are many countries that offer cheaper taxes. But Ireland is still the go-to place for international companies simply because it has the required infrastructure and workforce. From the perspective of a company executive, you can try and invest your money in new places, but you have to build the required infrastructure from scratch, and try finding skilled employees to employ. That in itself might be a nightmare if the country has low educational standard or most of the people can speak English. Some companies think it's worth it to try, but most don't, so why not go to Ireland? The infrastructure is already built, and there's an abundance of skilled employees there. Similar to how Silicon Valley is the hub of tech startups, simply because all tech startups are located there, so it has the required infrastructure and talent pool, Ireland is the hub of financial services and high-tech manufacturing, simply because it is home to most companies that do that kind of stuff. So it has the required infrastructure and an abundance of talented people in the relevant industries. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.